Started. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here. A lot of you know me. My name is Kevin McCumber. I'm an MIT alum, class of 2005 undergraduate, 2011 PhD, both in course 3, material science and engineering. And I organize fine food and beverage tastings and other now not so much tastings, but informational events for the MIT Alumni Club of Boston. And with the move to online, we've been able to open those events up to alumni outside the Boston area, which has been an absolute blast. And a lot of you are not from Boston, and it's great to have you here. A lot of you are also not even MIT alumni, and that's awesome to have you as well. As far as I'm concerned, for the evening, everyone is an MIT alumnus if you're a whiskey enthusiast. So I want to thank the MIT Club of Boston for continuing to, get behind and support these events. It's not 100% given that people are in favor of alcohol-related events, especially in nowadays. So the club has been a leader in thinking proactively about how to bring alumni together, and I do appreciate their continued support for these events. I also want to thank other MIT clubs across the country and internationally who help get the word out about these events, and the MIT Alumni Association, who coordinates amongst clubs to make sure that we're all talking about the events that we're doing. I'd like to thank Holly Seidewand, our presenter for the evening, who put a lot of work into making sure that we had kits available, making sure that we had smooth coordination with our retailer, making sure that we had a presentation put together, and thinking through a lot of things with me. A lot of options went on the table to bring this to fruition. So thanks so much, Holly, for your diligence and your thoughtfulness. She's obviously a whiskey lover, because somebody who's not could have just as easily signed up to present tonight and just kind of given it, I'd say, not nearly as much effort as Holly has. So I think you'll see, and that'll come through, how much passion Holly really has for the subject. I also want to thank Bikram and Elias at Norfolk Wine and Spirits for being our retail tie-in. For those of you in the Boston area who got the kits, you know that they did delivery of the kits, which was above and beyond, I think, what you would expect from most retailers. They spent about 3 full days delivering kits around the Boston area. So really appreciate their help with the event and supporting the MIT alumni as we try to learn more about whiskey and blending whiskey. And then finally, I'd like to thank all of you for, again, taking an evening of your time to join fellow alumni and whiskey enthusiasts to learn more about the world of whiskey. I hope you find this fun. I hope you find it educational, kind of a bit of a respite from the day-to-day and some of the concerns that we have on a daily basis. I don't take those things at all lightly, obviously, but we hope that this can provide some enlightenment and some engagement outside of the normal day-to-day. Okay, try to advance the slide here. So, very simple agenda tonight. I'm going to conclude my introduction in a few minutes, and then we'll hand off to Holly for the whiskey blending workshop, and she's going to be doing the Q&A as we go along. This is a little bit of a difference from previous events where we've held questions until a Q&A session. So Holly's going to be taking those as we go. And then we'll go into breakouts near the end. And if you're not familiar with breakouts, this is where we divide randomly into groups of 5 to 6 folks and get into a virtual room and just talk about the whiskey that's in our glass. If you've made a blend, what the blend is that you made, what you think of it, who you are, where you are, what you're doing in life, any of those kinds of things. It's just a good chance to connect amongst us as people. And then, of course, we have a little bit of an after party. So after the breakouts, we'll come back together. And if you'd like to stay around, you're more than welcome. Holly has said she can stick around a little bit after the stated end time to chat with us. So everyone can come off mute if you like, talk to Holly, talk to me, talk to other folks. And it's just a good way to socialize as a group. Yes, this is being recorded, and it will be posted on the MIT Club of Boston's YouTube channel for all posterity, so that you can go back and relive the joy that was this event. You can also feel free to forward it on to your friends and family and let them enjoy the wonders of blending whiskey. I also would like to remind you that, as you know, this event is free to attend, and in exchange for the value that you feel you've received from the event, I kindly ask that you join me in making a contribution to one or more of MIT's COVID-19 funds. These are going toward people who are affected by COVID-19 in the MIT community, as well as toward research that MIT is doing into the many effects and their solutions in this crisis. So appreciate anything you can give, and I hope that you will support them for the betterment of humankind. Mankind thanks you for any contribution. Tonight, as in previous events, we're submitting questions through the Meeting Pulse website. So go to meet.ps/MIT Whiskey Blending. And once I stop giving this introduction, I'll put that link in the Zoom, in the chat as well. So just go out there, you can submit your question. You can also upvote other people's questions. So the ones that get the most upvotes go to the top, and then Holly is just going to answer those as she goes along and as she sees fit. And instead of me posing all those to Holly, I'm just going to sit back and enjoy the evening and blend some very tasty whiskey. Okay, I always want to get to know the crowd. So we've got, as usual, a little poll queued up for you here. I'm going to kick that off right now. Just asking you about your class year at MIT. If you have multiple MIT degrees, pick your favorite, or maybe your least painful. Also questioning where you're located and your experience level with whiskey in general, as well as the whiskeys of the evening. So we'll just give that about a minute.
It's cool.
We've got one advanced, Holly. I hope that you're in the advanced category.
Can I vote?
Oh, of course. Yes, please, everybody. All right. We're at about half of people voted. Give it a few more seconds. I know this is not always super easy on mobile interfaces. All right. Looks like we have most responses in. I'm going to close the polling and I'll share the results. So just a real quick real-time analysis. Looks like, oh, we're evenly split for the most people from 1970s and 1980s. We have one alum from the 1950s. I might know who that is. Thank you very much for joining. It's awesome to have alumni spanning the 50s to 2020 and current students. So, you know, whiskey is, I think, a great bonding experience, and I think this shows that to be true. Most folks coming from the East Coast, not surprising since it's a Club of Boston event. Do appreciate folks joining from other parts of the country. Sorry we weren't able to get you tasting kits, blending kits. Of course, you know, liquor laws are a little bit strange and we can't ship things across states, and I think Holly would have gone insane even if we could. So sorry to those who weren't able to get the blending kits who are from outside the Massachusetts area. Looks like we're primarily novices, so that's awesome because that means you're going to learn a lot tonight. And most people have heard of one or a few of the brands. I actually had never heard of the Devon myself, so I would fall into that category as well. And looks like a lot of folks have also never heard of any of the brands, so Holly has her work cut out for her. Okay, very good. Thank you for that. Just a quick slide before we get to Holly. As you know, this is part of a series of events focused on fine foods and fine beverages, especially alcoholic beverages. So we have a couple of events coming up that I wanted to make sure you're aware of. In about 4 weeks' time, we have our rum masterclass, and that's with Eduardo Bacardi, who is MIT class of 2015, mechanical engineering, and he's going to be giving us a rum masterclass because he is the director of sales and marketing for a rum brand called Ron del Barrilito in Puerto Rico. He's 6th generation of the Bacardi family, but he's part of this artisanal rum brand now, and he's going to be giving us an awesome class, including a tour, a real-time tour of his distillery down there in Puerto Rico. And then about a month after that, mid-October, October 15th, we'll be doing the MIT Alumni and Food and Beverage. This is the first time I've tried this. It's going to be a presentation and panel discussion among 3 MIT alumni who are now in the food and beverage industries. They'll be talking about their career paths, how MIT helped them get there, and what they're seeing in current state and future in the food and beverage industries. So really excited to see that come to fruition. We're also working on a couple more events for the remainder of the year and early next year, one of them being a potential cheese event that came up as the #1 most requested event on our post-event surveys. You will be getting a survey after this event as well, so please do fill that out because we pay a lot of attention to what you say there. Cheese came out as the #1 request, so I'm working on that. Being from Wisconsin, I feel like I have to do a cheese event, even if people don't request it, so you're going to get cheese one way or another. If you want to stay apprised of these events, please join my email list. I'll send that out in the post-event email. You can sign up for that. We also have a fairly new Facebook group called the MIT Alumni Fine Spirit Society. I recommend that you join that. That will allow us to connect as well between events if there's anything we want to discuss between the times we get together here on Zoom. All right. For me, it is my very big pleasure to welcome Holly Seidewand back to the MIT Crown. So I knew Holly because she was in retail at Gordon's here in the Boston area a number of years ago. She actually succeeded Nick Taylor, whom we met for a previous event here virtually. But Holly was awesome at Gordon's, and I really liked her passion, like I mentioned. And now she's on her most recent venture representing the single malt Bacardi. So I reached out to Holly because I figured she would do a great job with us tonight, and said she agreed. Put a lot of effort into making tonight happen. So Holly, the show is yours. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Kevin.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should. The elephant in the room is always as well. That last slide said Bacardi over the top of the whiskey. That can be sometimes confusing, and we'll touch on that too. But know that these brands have been owned by Bacardi, except for Baines that we're going to be going through. But I'll explain a lot of that in regards to Dewar's and some of the single malts that we're going to be focusing on today. So. Like Kevin had mentioned, I call Boston my hometown, even though I'm born and raised in New York. Lived there for a bit as the whiskey specialist at Gordon. So if you saw a girl running cases up and down the stairs, making sure that you get all of your Pappy Van Winkle bottles and all of your specialty Scotch releases, that was probably me around 2017 and 18. So if I have met some of you, it's great to see you again. And thanks, Kevin, for organizing this. I know we took a lot of time to figure out, how we wanted to really make this special, to talk about the whole Scotch category, which we're going to touch on today, but also being able to zoom in on some specific flavor profiles. So we should have a fun ride. Hopefully, I know there were some mic issues. So can everyone hear me okay? Everything's all right? Okay, because you have to deal with me for another 45 minutes. So we'll stick with that. And let me just say, this is amazing. I just want to take a quick photo. We have 83 people on this call. This is really, really cool. So sorry, you're all going to be on a nice photo if you want to wave. Don't worry. I won't find you on Instagram and tag you, so it's fine. So let's get started too. I have a presentation. Like I said, it's more to help ease us through some of the things that we're going to be tasting. Don't worry, it's not all the decks we have to look at for work on screens these past few months. And just to get started too, I think I have a slide for it as well. So we'll touch base on how to drink all of the whiskey and what you should pour first. So let's get all of these screens set up here. Got a few different windows. All right. Move this over here. Okay, how's it look? Everyone can see it. So the next big teaser is you do not have all of these whiskeys, right? But it's just the nice photo showing all of the different single malts that I work on. Again, actually my role for North America is focused on these single malt scotches. And I know we have a broad range of interest in whiskey and knowledge and different expertise. And to be honest, this should cover all bases because we're going to be talking about the whole Scotch category. These single malts are all components of blended Scotch. And so we'll dive into the nuances of why the two categories of Scotch, single malt and blended Scotch, have risen to such acclaim, and historically how that came about. And then of course, we're going to try and be our own blenders for the night and be able to make our own blend. So I will say here, this is what, if you did get the kit, on the left is what you should have received. Obviously, it's a full bottle of the 12-year-old. So you can pour as much of that as you'd like. And then we have some of the minis of the other whiskeys, and we'll explain where each of them come into play for a potential blend that we're going to make. But I would say though, is I want you to all start drinking though, because it is Friday night or Friday evening. Pour yourself a whiskey, grab a few glasses too. So whatever you have, rocks glasses. I have like this nice plastic one that I sometimes do blending in. You know, if you have a Glencairn, even a white wine glass, really any glass that you have, if you can get a few glasses as well, and only pour about half of the vials out. I know that it is a small amount, but I'd like you to taste them and still have some left over for the blending session. That's why we gave you a full bottle of Aberfeldy 12, so you can just pour a nice heavy pour of that and have that on the side while you sample and start to get the different flavor profiles of the other whiskeys that you have. And we'll walk through how you might choose each one to make your own blended Scotch whiskey. So if you do need a moment to go and grab, you know, as much glassware as you can, again, rocks glass, whatever you have, is fine. Not everyone has snifters all over their home. And one quick thing that we talked about as well, if you're new to whiskey or if you come from the wine side, these are all ranging from 40% ABV up to 46%. So these have a punch, right? We're drinking a decent amount of alcohol. So when nosing and tasting these, it's going to be a little bit different than wine. So when you have that glass right here, obviously our nose and our palate are connected. So you're going to want to leave your mouth open a little bit. Just kind of move the glass back and forth in front of your nose. You'll see that alcohol is going to jump out at you. You don't need to, you know, stick it right in there. You might burn off some of your nose hair. So just have it waft back and forth in front of your nose and try and literally breathe in so you can get some of those aromas. And then when you take that first sip, take a very small sip of whiskey and know again that if it's your first whiskey of the day, which it is not my first whiskey of the day, but if it is your first whiskey of the day, know that it's 40%, maybe even 46% if you started with Craigellachie. It might burn a little bit, right? And it's okay. We're just kind of warming up that palate. You want to actually let that whiskey, that small amount, sit on your tongue and just slowly let it coat your mouth. Don't swoosh it because that definitely will burn like mouthwash. Just roll it around, open your mouth if you can, let some of the oxygen evaporate. And this is what will actually start to get those flavors that we talk about, right? Really on that second and third, and these are very, very little sips. Whiskey drinking is a very slow process because we have such a higher alcohol content. Also too, you have your little pipette as well. I have little water droppers. If something is too aggressive, you can actually lower the ABV manually, right? There's no problem at all by actually adding in your own water. A lot of people will do ice, so it is a hot evening, so maybe you'd like to do that. I tend to do room temperature though, because you'll leave the true characteristics and quality of the spirit. So, you know, put a few drops of water, keep adding until it seems a little bit more palatable, but know that water is fine too to manually lower that ABV. So definitely keep drinking. Don't just listen to me blabber on about this without having a dram in hand. So this is what the kit will include. We'll use the pipette and the funnel for some blending as well. So we're going to do, and I know a lot of you are technical as well, so, and actually let me bring up this, see if I can get the questions up a little bit bigger here because they're gonna start coming in. So we've got the chat. And then we've got, let's see here. I'm just trying to pull up the other questions that you sent. Let's see here. I just need to exit full screen. If anyone knows how to exit full screen. see. Escape. Thank you.
Oops.
Oh, that stopped the sharing. Okay, hold on, everyone. Sorry about that. I'm having trouble, Kevin, getting the questions, your question box to be up while I share this.
You're talking about the Meeting Pulse website?
Yeah.
You'll just be able to see it yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not able to, if anyone has, it's just giving me full screen when I go into share screen. If anyone knows how I can make it maybe the share screen half the size.
Oh, okay. I think what you could do is stop the screen share and just share the application.
If you're on a Mac, I am on a Mac, swipe 4 fingers to the left. What does that even mean? 4 fingers. Swipe fine. Okay, I'll try one more time and then we'll
Okay. If not, I can pose them to you. Nothing's coming.
Well, I want you to enjoy your whiskey too.
Oh, I am.
Zoom really doesn't play nicely. Yeah, I might be able to pull it up on my phone too. So
Well, there you go.
let me just do that and then I can prop my phone up. Because I think the slides will be quite helpful for everyone to see. Okay. Sorry, everyone.
All right.
Even when you do these multiple times a month, there's always something new.
I always find new ways to do something silly on Zoom.
So let's see here. Oh, these are your questions. I think this might work. Then I can just prop my phone up right here. I already see a question, so I think we're okay.
Yep, that's the first one.
We'll do that. We're all multitaskers, so okay. Let's share this again.
All right.
Okay, and I still have the chat if anyone wants it, the regular chat for Zoom. Okay, so we need to do a quick overview of the most basic of what I think for Scotch whiskey, or the easiest to understand. And some of you may have been at distilleries, and some of you, maybe even bourbon distilleries, maybe you've been to Scotland, but I really like to start with single malt Scotch. So if you're drinking the Aberfeldy, the Craigellachie, or the Royal Brackla, these are the ones that we're talking about right now. So to be a single malt Scotch, it's made out of 100% malted barley and from one single distillery. Now a blended Scotch whiskey, which is what we're going to be making, or a version of it, and the Dewars, is going to be a marriage of typically anywhere from 20, we obviously have less than that, but 20 to 40 different single malts plus corn, or what we call grain whiskey, all married together. So that's why we gave you some different components of single malts that you can play around with. Those are more polarizing flavor profiles. And then we also gave you that Baines single grain, which we'll talk about as well. So as you start to taste those, know that we're using 2 different grains. See, we're still talking about some of the Zoom things. So 2 different grains. So the first one that I want to start with is the barley. It's the easiest to understand. So when you think about grapes and wine and natural fermentation, it makes a bit more sense with that fruit component. If you were to go out in a vineyard and pop a grape in your mouth, it's sweet, right? We know that there's some sort of sugar content in there, and we know that there's naturally occurring yeast that can actually metabolize and eat those sugars and have byproducts of heat, CO2, and alcohol. So we're actually utilizing and want the byproducts of that fermentation. With barley, it's an extra step, but we are humans, and so since the dawn of time and in many textbooks, we want to make alcohol of whatever we have left over, right? So if you're a farmer in Scotland and you go out to your barley field, because it's quite hardy, so they would grow a lot of barley and potentially wheat in Scotland. You go out to that field, you already made enough bread, you already sold enough off to your neighbor, whatever you were going to do with that barley. Now you have some left over. What do you do with it? You try and make alcohol with it. So we actually have to malt our barley though, because if you were to pop a barley seed right out of the field into your mouth and try and bite it, it would not be sweet. It might even crack your tooth. So it's going to be very hard. There's actually a lot of starch. Yes, slightly before the dawn of time for alcohol. So there's going to be a lot of starch. And we need to do an extra step, which is called malting, before we can gain access and convert that starch into sugar. So we're going to steep the grains in hot water and actually trick it into germinating. And that sugar content is actually going to be converted from those larger starch molecules. So that's step one in a single malt distillery. So if you went to Royal Brackla or Aberfeldy or Craigellachie, that is the first step of the process. So we have to prepare the grain and gain access to the sugar. We're going to mill down that barley, move it over into the mash tun where we're basically going to make a porridge. So we're going to continue to add hot waters to that milled down barley, continue to drain away that sugary water that we now have, move that into what are called washbacks in Scotland. And it's basically just a big fermentation vessel. So we're gonna chuck in some yeast, and over a few days' time, every distillery is different, we'll let that metabolizing happen. So that yeast will start to eat that sugar. And then here we actually have a beer, and I equate the fermentation to be, in Scotland specifically with barley-based whiskey, if you went and maybe at night had a blue moon and then left it out and then drank it again the next morning. So like a warm, slightly older blue moon, you know, it's got some fruit, malty qualities. They'll all be a little bit different, but it has that sort of texture to it. We take that beer and we'll distill it twice to get a higher alcohol by volume, and then we're going to fill it into casks. So very simple steps, and all of the distilleries would look like this, but all of the distilleries will do different lengths of fermentation, different size of stills, different cut points on the stills. All these different variations at each distillery make all of these distilleries in Scotland taste different. And these are really the building blocks of how we get all of these different styles of whiskey or malt whiskey coming from Scotland. So I've got this adorable little video. I threw in some videos and some questions into my presentation too. And while you guys watch this, I can actually look at the chat and see what we've got going on here. Yeah, so we'll talk about the exceptional casks as well in a little bit. And infinity bottles. Yes, infinity bottles are fun. We'll talk about those too at the end, how about, when we're actually making our own whiskey. Because I imagine that some of you have some Scotch on your shelves, and we'll probably add to this blending kit that we've provided, which I highly encourage as well. This is really just a test kit that we've provided, and we hope that you can go out and actually start maybe marrying some of the whiskeys that you buy. So here you've got distillation. We're going to distill it again twice, get above that 40% ABV, separating by boiling points that alcohol away from the water. Again, very simple processes, but obviously really starting to have those building blocks of flavors at each distillery. And then we're going to take different cut points here, get rid of that methanol at the top, take this heart run or the middle cut, and then also have the tails or the feints that will move away. We take that heart run, and that's what we fill into casks and wait. So you have to wait a minimum of 3 years and a day to be called Scotch whiskey. So it will sit in those casks, and of course we're leaving it for typically much longer than that. So that's the basic process. We're going to be using the terms of maturation quite a bit, so I like to throw these in. American oak, these are the types of casks that we'll typically use and what we're using in the whiskeys that you're trying today. Casks that previously held bourbon. So we're going to take on some of those flavor profiles, as you see here, that vanilla, toffee, almond quality. Think of when you drink bourbon, what it tastes like. And then also Oloroso sherry. We say ex-sherry, but in the Scotch whiskey world, we're also using Oloroso sherry casks as well. So you're getting more of that baking spice sort of quality, a little bit of a heavier quality than the ex-bourbon cask. So this is the basic process that we're all using. And here you have a map of Scotland showing the different regions. Different regions do different styles of production. We're really going to be focusing on the Highland and Speyside region. So we'll dive into those flavor profiles. As you probably are tasting, we don't have anything peated. but this is my first question of the day. You can put this in the Zoom chat just to keep everyone on their toes. This is a softball for some people, so know that they're going to get more difficult. But what is the island within Scotland that is known for that peated, smoky, medicinal campfire whiskey? Okay, good. Now, see, now I should ask people to pronounce it. That should be the next quiz.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Extra credit.
This is Isla. Yes, perfect. And Skye and Jura do make peated whiskeys. You know, we've got Talisker on Skye and actually a few more. We have Jura Distillery on Jura. But really, Isla is the most famous and has the most distilleries making that peated style. So the whiskeys that we're trying today do not have that peated quality. Craigellachie, we do something a little bit special that's similar to the peated process, and we'll talk about that when we get to Craigellachie as well. So as you see, we left the rest of the UK off this map, so just focusing on Scotland for tonight. And I think one moment, my window's open and it's thunderstorming, so hold on. Okay, if you're in New York like I am, hopefully you're enjoying the thunderstorm. So now let's talk a little bit about the history and why we actually started making different styles of whiskey, not from barley. Because barley historically is equated to Scotland and the type of whiskey that we make. So as you see here, first records in Scotland, we're not going to debate who was first, Ireland or Scotland. I'll let you all decide who created whiskey first or this style of whiskey. But the records are 1494 for Scotland. And as you see, up until really 1823, the majority of, or really all of what was being produced in Scotland was A, illegal, and mostly smugglers and bootleg and moonshiners. And you see that taxes were always involved, right? So these are some of the key driving factors of why we started making grain whiskey. So as you see, most of what was happening was pot still distillation, like we just reviewed. It would be very, very small setups of stills and fermentations, and it would be very farm driven. It was very expensive to have a distilling license in Scotland before 1823. So it is said by Dave Broom, one of the top whiskey writers of our time, there were said to be thousands of illicit stills in the Highlands of Scotland before 1823. Scotland's not that big if you've been there, so that's a lot of stills being hidden throughout the heather and brush, and obviously it's a wild terrain. But it was really in 1823 when we had that Excise Act where you saw it being more viable. They actually lowered the tax rate, and you saw a lot of distilleries like Glenlivet, this Royal Brackla here actually as well, actually gaining and acquiring true licenses for distilling proper whiskey. And that really changed the game, right? So that was a huge factor to where now you have people making a viable business out of Scotch whiskey. Before it was all just farm driven, right? It was very regional. You just bought what your neighbor was producing or what you were producing. It was on a much smaller scale. And here, this is where we have the whiskey barons, which is where Dewar's comes into play. Johnny Walker was a person, Buchanan's was a person, Ballantyne's. These are all people that took this opportunity to capitalize on this business venture, start marrying whiskeys together. And we also, at the same point, started really utilizing, in Scotland in particular, Ireland chose not to, the continuous still. So we decided to actually marry malt whiskey that was produced on pot stills in the original Scottish way, and also a quicker, more efficient production method with what would end up to be a cheaper grain as well. We would then use column distillation to produce our corn or wheat whiskey. And to this day, column stills and column distillation produces the most amount of whiskey worldwide. And so these two reasons are why blended Scotch is now king. So it started as malt whiskey. Obviously, we still drink single malts and they're growing, but blended Scotch is king. So these are your main categories of Scotch whiskey. And as you see, single malt and blends are the biggest ones. And I love this slide. This is actually was released from the spirits business in the publication, I think, last month. If you look, these are all of the top by volume exported Scotch whiskey brands. Some of these names you might see familiar. Dewar's is in there, right? We're drinking some Dewar's tonight. There is not one single malt Scotch listed here. So by volume, you can just produce more blended Scotch whiskey. So does anyone know what number one might be? The King. And just to give you some context, 18.4 million, and these are actually what's called 9-liter cases. So you have to multiply it by 2. 36.8 million 6-packs of Johnnie Walker were exported in 2019. That's a lot of whiskey, and we could not do that without column distillation. And this is really what drives the Scotch whiskey industry. Malt whiskey is just produced on a much slower scale. It's batch style in those pot stills. So I just really love the volume and seeing the context of who is still king in this whiskey world. So as we move forward, now let's focus on Aberfeldy. So hopefully I can see some glasses go up to everyone's nose and start to nose and taste Aberfeldy. Again, pour a heavy amount of this one since we have a full bottle. This is probably the one too, if you're in different parts of the country, it's probably the most well-known brand and maybe the one that everyone has seen before as well. This distillery is a Highland distillery. So this was actually founded by the Dewar's family, and this is where Kevin and I actually got the concept of let's actually tie back the historical context of Dewar's and the Dewar's family, their only distillery, which was Aberfeldy Distillery. So what happened with the Dewar's family is the distillery was founded in 1898. And that's actually, I snuck this question in here too, just because it's my favorite question. So we're in the Highlands of Scotland. What famous author has a house not far from this distillery? Maybe someone's been there and has heard the stories. You can type it in the Zoom chat too. I'm going to check the other chat as well. Does anyone? No one knows? Matt, you can't answer. Yes, it's J.K. Rowling. So we all always try to see her when we go to the distillery. It's probably one of her many homes, and apparently she does not want to be bothered. But I really think that one day I will see her at the distillery drinking some Aberfeldy. So she does have a home in the village of Aberfeldy, not far from the distillery. And I wanted to answer this one question here in regards to production techniques. Let's see here. Why is the malted barley dried before being fermented when it's just going to get wet again? So it's dried to be milled down. So that malting process, we have to mill it to actually break down the husk and really gain access to the core of the grain. And that's when we then put it into the mash tun to continue to harness those sugars out of the grain. So hopefully that helps. You need a lot of water for production of whiskey, obviously. So this is the Dewar's family. So in the 1830s, actually, John Dewar Sr., who's in the top right, he was born not far from the village of Aberfeldy. He was born in a town called Dull, which apparently has been sistered to other towns. I guess there's, what is it, Boring in Oregon. There's a few different sister cities to Dull. He was a crofter, so I imagine his life was actually quite busy with farm work and probably not dull at all. But once he was of age in his late teens, he actually moved to Perth and started working for, within his family, they had a grocery store. And this is how a lot of blended Scotch whiskies began. And so he joined the store, ended up taking ownership, and this is where he started blending his own whiskey at the shop. So he was buying malt whiskey from multiple different distilleries, buying grain whiskey from those column distilleries and column distillation, and was making his own whiskeys. He was one of the first people to put the Dewar's name on his whiskey, to put his own name on it. So he was obviously very proud of it. And after a few decades, his two sons, John Dewar Jr. and then Tommy Dewar, Junior's in the middle and Tommy's on the right, they decided to slowly but surely take over the business. And what do you do when you are growing your business is try and control some of that supply chain. So they wanted to own their own distillery for some more control over their blends. And so they went back to his hometown and built Aberfeldy Distillery. So since 1898, this distillery has been here producing malt whiskey, but it's only been available as this standalone single malt that you have here for the past few years. So it's always been going into blends. And so that is true for a lot of whiskeys to this day. There's a lot of single malt whiskeys that we just actually aren't able to drink because their main function is still to go into blends. So this is the family heritage here. You see the distillery obviously is actually open to the public, so you can go see this distillery. Great railroad access, everything that you needed to build a distillery back then. Great access to water with the Patilly Burn, which is our water source. Obviously the Puggy and the train right here that would eventually go further north and down to London. So this was a great site, and it would continue to expand throughout the 1900s. So this is the heritage of the Dewars family, and to this day, Aberfeldy has always been a component of Dewars. And so that's why it might be fun as well to try the Aberfeldy 12 and the Dewars 12 side by side and see what you might be able to taste. Now, some people do, there's some old marketing jargon that says Aberfeldy is the heart of Dewars. Our master blender, who we'll talk about in a minute, says that's actually not always the case. There's about 40 different malt whiskeys in Dewars, but it's always been a component of Dewars. So it definitely, our roots are tied into that Dewars heritage. Let's see if we've got some questions. Yeah, we've got some, and we'll actually talk about some finishing casks right here as well. So this is who's controlling all of our whiskey, basically. So who's deciding what malt whiskeys go where? Obviously tonight we're making some of those decisions, but what malt whiskeys go where, what grain whiskeys we want to use, and what ratios we want to use. And in blended Scotch, it's really a very well-kept secret. So we don't know all of the whiskeys that go into Dewars or into Johnny Walker or into Ballantine's because it could change. So it's not actually released to the public. So Stephanie McLeod, who is down on the bottom left, she has been blending Dewars for almost 2 decades, and she designed all of the single malts that we are drinking today as well. So I, of course, have a true love affair with her. We're drinking what Stephanie likes tonight, and her first creation was this Dewars 15. So she took on the legacy from some of the past blenders of the Dewars history and blenders line. And her first product innovation was this Dewars 15. You're tasting the 12 tonight, which was before her time, and she's maintained it. Her name's Stephanie McLeod, and we can type it in the chat as well, so you can look her up. She actually just won Master Blender of the Year as well from the International Spirits Competition. And if anyone is, follows their master blenders quite closely, does anyone know since the 1830s, when Dewars was founded, how many master blenders have had control of this liquid? Does anyone have a guess? 3, a little bit more than 3. Yeah, so Drew got it. So she's the 7th blender. So obviously once you have this title, usually you hold on pretty tight to it. So she, of course, is so important to the flavor consistency and how our whiskeys are bottled each time. I don't think people realize how difficult it would be to take 40 different whiskeys, and some might not be available each batch that you do, so you have to get a different whiskey. Cask maturation, casks are all over the place with how they mature. They're all a little bit different, and she makes our whiskeys taste almost the same to us every time we buy it. It's really an amazing feat when you think about that volume that they're actually producing. So she's, we're drinking to Stephanie tonight as well. So this is the Aberfeldy Distillery. So the key factors of what's driving the flavor profiles of Aberfeldy 12-year-olds are, A, we're unpeated, right? So we don't have that smoky medicinal campfire quality. So no smoky qualities coming off of Aberfeldy. And we're known as the Golden Dram because of our very long fermentations. We typically in Scotland will ferment anywhere, an average fermentation will be from 50 to 60 hours. The longer you go, typically you'll get more of a sweeter, fruit-forward, even floral flavor profile to that beer that we're making before distillation. And at Aberfeldy Distillery, everything will, at least for 72 hours, sit in that fermentation vessel. So it's quite long for Scotland. Other parts of the world will ferment for, you know, there's people that are doing 2 weeks right now. You obviously don't get more alcohol content. You're just trying to encourage some different flavors. So because of that extra long fermentation, right off of the still at Aberfeldy, it's a very honeyed quality to it. Obviously, we can't add honey. That's not legal for a single malt Scotch whiskey. So it's naturally occurring, and it's really being driven from those longer fermentations. And it's the golden dram because honey is golden, right? So you get a lot of these sweet honeyed notes. And I'm drinking Royal Brackla right now, but the Aberfeldy 12 for me on the nose has a lot of that sweetness is there. And on the palate, I get more of that spice. Let's see. Yeah, I've got some, let's see if there's some more questions in here. So the wine cask finishes. So yeah, I mean, obviously there's some different finishes that you can have in the Scotch whiskey world when it comes to maturation. If you start having to move marry lots of casks together and then pump it into wine casks, obviously you're actually losing some liquid, and it's a pretty difficult process. And also just the wine casks are quite expensive. So you will probably pay a premium for wine cask finishes, but they are out there. And just wink, wink, if you like wine cask finishes, we may have some becoming available of Aberfeldy in the fall. So just keep an eye out for those sorts of things too. So this is a distillery here in Scotland, or at Aberfeldy, and you'll see here some of the flavor notes that Stephanie typically finds. So hopefully everyone's palate is different. So you might find something very unique to your upbringing, or even what you ate today or what mood you're in. But these are some of the classic notes that we think of when we drink the Aberfeldy 12-year-old. So there's a question here. Stephanie is the first female of those 7 master blenders. So there's a decent amount of female master blenders now in Scotland. Rachel Berry is another one for Brown Forman with Glenn Dronick and Ben Rioch and Glenn Glassow. So there definitely are more females involved in that blending process now. Let's see here. Okay, and so this is the range of whiskeys that we have as well for Aberfeldy Distillery. So the 12, the 16 actually has an extra finishing time in Oloroso sherry cask for a further 6 months, and then the 21-year-old as well. Are there any questions on Aberfeldy? We'll take a minute to finish our drams, and I'll check both chats to see if there's anything specific on that distillery. This is, I would assume, the one that maybe some of you have had before and have tasted. This is definitely, keep in the back of your mind, this is a great one for your blend. As you see it, it probably plays well with other whiskeys, so keep that in mind when you're thinking about what you might want to make for your blend later on as well. All right, so let's move on to Craigellachie. And I know I don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to cruise through this. And you are all more technical than I am. I actually went to school for marketing and then sports management, and then hated that, and then got my MBA. So I know this from just working at distilleries. I have, and I do have a distillation degree, but you guys actually might have more insight into some of the technical wherewithal with Craigellachie. But this is a really, really fun distillery, and we're really going to get a little bit nerdier with Craigellachie as well, and talking about the equipment at the distillery. So we all know the basic production techniques of malt whiskey and fermentation and distillation, but there's actually a lot of components in regards to copper and copper contact that needs to be discussed in the production of whiskey as well. So a little bit older time frame up in that Speyside region, so a little bit further north of Aberfeldy. Craigellachie is tough to pronounce, but it is the name of the village that it sits in. You may have heard of McAllen, which sits in the village of Craigellachie as well. So a very famous region for whiskey whiskey production. So this is the distillery here. We have 4 stills as well. And Craigellachie is the last distillery to this day. Oh, I guess I don't even know where I put my own questions. Let's see here. So some of you have been to Scotland. So does anyone know what famous hotel is right down the road from this distillery? It was founded by one of our co-founders, Alexander Edwards. It seems tricky, but I think you'll all kick yourselves when it comes out. Across the street is the Highlander Inn. If anyone's heard of the Highlander Inn or been to the Speyside region. This one's tricky. Yeah, you all kick yourselves. It's the Craigellachie Hotel. Now, the reason that I mention this is that obviously in Scotland there's great whiskey. I would say it's fair to argue that the Craigellachie Hotel is one of the top whiskey bars in Scotland. And that's saying a lot, right? Just from selection and choices in regards to independent bottlings and all of the whiskeys that they have there. So please do not pass up this village. A lot of people will go up to Dufftown or Elgin to go see a lot of the big name distilleries. But I promise you, stopping at the Craigellachie Hotel and then right across the street is the Highlander Inn is definitely not something to be missed. You might want to stay at the hotel as well if you're going to be having as much whiskey as most typically do at this distillery. So what do we do different at Craigellachie is we are the last distillery to burn oil underneath our maltings. So just to complicate this a little bit further, it's the same sort of concept as peated whiskey. So if you've ever had Lagavulin or Lafroig or those Isla style whiskeys where you crack open the bottle and you can smell a campfire almost coming from across the room, that's actually happening from that first step of the malting process. If you think of rural Scotland in the early 1800s, what's your most cost-effective fuel source in the Highlands? It's going to be peat bogs, and especially on those coastal regions. It was also crude oil. Now, hopefully you drank some of that Craigellachie before I told you that we burn oil underneath the malt. I promise you that it is safe and we're using such a small amount. It's just the fuel source. And I have drank so much Craigellachie. Actually, a lot of what you see on the back shelf is different versions of Craigellachie, and I've been drinking it for many, many years. So, and I turned out fine, I think. So I promise you it is fine to drink. It's just like peat was an original fuel source. So last distillery, when we're drying out that grain, we're actually going to, it's called a peat reek or a peat smoke, and for us, it'll be an oil reek. So we'll lay out all of that damp grain during malting over a sieve floor, and we'll actually let that smoke rise up and attach to the damp grain as it's drying. And so if you're tasting the Craigellachie, you might get some of this almost burnt spice coupled with the fruit. There's some aggression to Craigellachie, and that is from that first step of the process. So we're the last distillery to utilize and do that process of oil-fired malt. Here, if I move, you've got the 23 here. Someone asked about Craigellachie. This is a Craigellachie from Single Cask Nation. This is a Craigellachie. So it might be hard to read, but trust me, that's one of the ones I collect. So, so the oil-fired malt making it a little bit more aggressive, and then also during the distillation process. So we're actually adding aggression into the grain by that oil-fired process. And then we are one of the last few distilleries to have very little copper contact in our distillation and condensing process. Those copper pot stills that are so iconic in Scotland, obviously they're beautiful, and if you're, depending on what distillery you're in, you can photograph them. They're so iconic, but they're so important and have been around for all alcohol production for really 3 main reasons. So copper is a great heat conductor, right? They're basically just kettles. We need to boil up that beer and then boil up those low wines for that second run. So we need to be able to heat something and boil it up. It's very malleable, right? So you'll see different shapes of stills in Scotland. You'll see tall shapes. You'll see short, fat, squat stills. You'll see what they call boil balls. You'll see different shapes and sizes of the stills. That will change the flavor profile of the whiskey. And also there are small chemical reactions that are happening between the alcohol and ethanol with that copper as it's boiling. So as that vapor and the liquid is touching the copper of those copper pot stills, you're actually having a lot of those sulfur compounds being stripped away. And stripped sounds like a negative term. It's, you might want more of that sulfur, you might want more of that aggression, or you might want to take a lot of it out. So some of you may have had Glenmorangie. If anyone's had Glenmorangie, the 10-year-olds specifically, they have very tall copper pot stills, right? So if you imagine a hot vapor trying to get up and out over that tall copper still, there's going to be a lot of copper contact. Other distilleries have very short, squat fat stills, so they don't want as much copper contact. They want a more robust, a bit of a bossier style spirit. So we talk about copper in these pot stills, but many times we don't talk about how we condense that vapor when we get it back into a liquid. So here is what you have, the original style. There's 18 of us left in Scotland, 18 distilleries left that utilize worm tub condensers. So I told you we use oil and worms, so it sounds like a pretty nasty whiskey, but I think you're probably all enjoying it because it's a really special whiskey. But here we have that copper pot still that we all know and love. A lot of times you'll go to a distillery and they don't even mention the condensing system. The condensing system, when taking it back from a vapor into a liquid, also has copper contact, is made out of copper. So if you imagine the worm tub condensers, which most distilleries shifted away from, imagine you're giving someone a big bear hug. And this always works a little bit better in person. But imagine you're giving someone a big bear hug, right? You've got this, you know, nice big circle. The shell and tube condensers, which are on the right, which most distilleries went to in the 50s and 60s. If you think of Mad Men era, we wanted a lighter style spirit. If you grab a bottle and if you look at the end of it, and they're all slightly different sizes at each distillery, but imagine a copper tube this size, which is shell and tube, or the worm tub, which is a bear hug. That hot vapor rushing into this surface area versus the bottom of a bottle, there's more aggressive copper contact in the modern way of condensing. So Craigellachie, we add aggression with that oil-fired process, and then we basically leave it in. So if you're getting some sweetness, you know, there's obviously still a fruity component to Craigellachie, but if it's also kind of punching you in the face a little bit, maybe attacking your cheeks, everyone gets it a little bit different with some spice, or some maybe just a burnt, even a matchstick sort of quality. That's because of these two processes. So Craigellachie is so near and dear to me because it really is history in a bottle. Whiskey was just more aggressive back then. So I like to show this little video just so you can see relative how large these worm tubs are. And trust me that this music to this video is amazing. So you're really gonna enjoy it, I think.
So the idea is normally a shell and tube condenser. Basically, it's a very small, tight space for the vapors to start to condense again into liquid. Because it's a tight space and surrounded by copper, there's a lot of copper contact, so that strips them maybe the sort of bigger, heavier notes out of the whiskey, giving you kind of a lighter character. And with Craigellachie, we're not looking for that. We're looking for that big, meaty, kind of full-bodied experience, if you like. They're called worm tubs because it looks like big worms almost sort of snaking through. It starts off as really, really big areas at the top, and it gets steadily smaller and smaller and smaller. There's more room, so there's less copper contact for those vapors to travel through. So basically it leaves you with a much bigger, sort of richer character. Like in the viscosity, the way it feels in your mouth is very different as well. That coupled with the barley we use from Glenest, those are the sort of two big factors that make Craigellachie.
You could all hear the music, right? That music is amazing. I listened to that video just for fun. Oh, it's gonna play again. So there are a few questions in here too. There's always questions about the oil. I've been told, and we've been to the facility where they actually malt our barley. We have our own dedicated kiln. No one wants to be anywhere near our process. It is crude oil. So what you would think for like tankers, or it's crude oil, but it's a very, very small amount of crude oil. So it is not olive oil. Someone wrote down. So not olive oil, although that might give you some extra viscosity. And I find Speyside somewhat sharper than Highlands. Is there a reason for this? I mean, it depends. I mean, actually, a lot of people think that you should start in the Speyside region because it tends to be more fruit forward, and the Highland region is a little bit heavier on the palate. Now, mind you, I started with peated whiskey. My first whiskey neat was Lagavulin 16. So everyone's palate is going to receive flavors a little bit differently. So whiskey really is a lifelong sport. You may like some things, and then in a few years, you might like a totally different region or a different style. So it really is just relative to each individual person. And when we talk about the regions, the Scotch Whisky Association has divided up Scotland into 5 whiskey producing regions to help us understand flavor profiles. But as you see, Craigellachie, its neighbors are Glenlivet and Glenfiddich, which are very fruit forward. Craigellachie has fruit, but it also has some aggression to it. So you have to take the regions with a bit of a grain of salt as well. And all of the single malts we're tasting tonight will be some sort of component of Dewar's too, by the way, although Baines is not. So these are some of the flavor profiles that Stephanie gets out of that Craigellachie 13. I'll answer the squirrel question about Aberfeldy a little bit. We'll do that in the breakout sessions. So we have a 13, 17, 23, and a 33, all prime numbers. When Stephanie was going to pick all of the casks many years before we released these in the warehouse, you would go to build maybe a 12-year-old and maybe a 16 or an 18. These are some of the standards that we see. And when she was building that 12-year-old, she found a lot of 13, 14-year-old whiskeys. Yes, the 33 is not prime. When you get older, you don't get to choose the age as much anymore. It tells you. So when she was building that 12-year-old, all of the casks were 13, 14 years old. So legally, it was a 13-year-old. It's already a very eclectic, unique style whiskey for its region. And so she just ran with it. So it's a 13, 17, and 23. The 33 was recently added to the core range. Any questions on Craigellachie? I know it's a very technical distillery and there's a lot of new terms for it, but I think it really helps to understand that burning of the oil and the less copper contact of why it's so much more robust than the other 2 whiskeys that we're trying tonight as well. I think I got everything that was in the chat, so everyone just loves it. Okay, great. So Royal Brackla. So we'll move into this last one before we start blending. So Royal Brackla is, as we say, fit for a king. I guess it's our fancy whiskey. Remember we mentioned that date 1823. This distillery is actually founded in 1812. And one of our founders was one of the people to actually fight for that new legislation and those new tax laws, because he actually had a legal license and it was losing money, right? It was not a viable business, and he wanted Scotch whiskey to be viable. But what that actually did was this distillery was producing whiskey in 1812 and started exporting a lot of their whiskey because they couldn't compete with the illicit distillers all around the distillery. This distillery is up in Nairn, so not far from Craigellachie, so we're really high up in the north of Scotland. And so he started exporting his whiskey. The King William, got a hold of it, really liked Royal Brackla, came up to visit the distillery, and we were the first ever single malt distillery to be granted a royal warrant. So we were just Brackla Distillery, but now legally we get to write Royal in front of our distillery name going forward. So it basically means we gave a lot of free whiskey to the crown. So that's basically what that means. But obviously it was great for marketing as well. I don't think I have it on the slide, but does anyone, if you want to type in the chat, if anyone knows the 2 other royal distilleries in Scotland, they don't give this title out anymore. So if you know the 2 others. Yep, Royal Lochnagar is one, which is around, but not a standalone single malt. It's a component of Johnnie Walker, small Highland distillery. The other distilleries closed down. So I'll just, I'll let everyone know. It's Glen Erie Royal. So Glen Erie Royal was demolished in the 90s. So there's only 2 of us left standing that can legally write Royal above our name for producing Scotch whiskey. So the ABV, that's a good question. The ABV for Aberfeldy and Royal Brackla is 40%. Craigellachie is 46%. So just a heads up. So this is the distillery as well. Not only is it royal, it actually sits on the Cawdor estate. So ties to Macbeth, not a shabby place to drink whiskey either. And what I love about, if you have some more of that Aberfeldy, try the Royal Brackla and Aberfeldy side by side. These two distilleries are both from the same region, the Highland region. Obviously different founding date, of course, and different people that founded it. But both are unpeated. Both have similar size and shape of stills, not as long fermentations at Royal Brackla, matured in the exact same way, and they taste completely different, right? They're sitting on your palate differently. The nose is different. We get a very honeyed quality off the still with Aberfeldy. Royal Brackla, I get this kind of delicate, almost grassy note to Royal Brackla. So obviously the casks are continuing to amplify those qualities, but Royal Brackla definitely has a little bit more of a calmer demeanor than the Aberfeldy and of course the Craigellachie. And I think people are noting that here in the chat as well. Oh, Crown Royal. Yeah, it's different because it's they're not based in the UK, so that's why it's a little bit different for distilleries outside. So yes, King William, first to grant it, and you will see that crest actually on Dewar's. You'll see it on some special editions of Lefroy. So different crests have been offered to different limited edition releases or blended Scotch. But the distilleries that we listed, Royal Brackla being the first, are the only distilleries. So everything that we produce at this distillery is deemed royal. Oh, I did have the question here, so we already answered it. Let's see here. So this here, I wanted to show you, this distillery is not open to the public, but it is one of the most, I mean, all of Scotland is beautiful and a great place to drink whiskey, but this is by far one of my favorite places to drink whiskey. So we're going to fast forward here to, I wrote it down, 522. Let's see here.
3 spirits.
Approachable dram.
This is some of the employees.
Brackla has one of the most interesting stories of any distillery. It was founded by a man called Captain William Fraser. He was a peppery Highland gentleman, proud of his ancestry, and a very quick temper. He never got on with the excise. He was fined by the excise authorities on 3 or 4 occasions for not paying duty and things like that. He resented paying duty, don't we all?
Royal Brackla is over 200 years old, built 1812, and it was the first royal distillery. So since the 1830s, it's had a royal warrant and was called the King's Own Whisky.
This is just such a beautiful spot. What a great place to make whiskey. In fact, I'm amazed at the guys who are actually in there in the still house. I've got the time to actually do all the governance that they need to do to make whiskey, because the view is so fantastic.
We firmly believe that Royal Brackla, having been perfected over 200 years, is an exceptional dram. It just tops off the enthusiasm that you have for the place. If somebody's enjoying what you're producing 10,000 miles away.
Whether you're in marketing or commercial or supply.
So it's and obviously it's classic gloomy, slightly rainy Scotland, but that is a pretty darn good view as well. So these are some of, oh, thanks for jumping around here. So these are some of the flavor profiles that Stephanie gets from this Royal Brackla 12. If anyone has their own tasting notes that they're getting, I know someone said that it's very smooth, and it definitely should feel smooth on the palate compared to Craigellachie, right? It's we've kind of went from more of that spice honeyed quality to some aggression, back down to more of a bit of a chilled out whiskey. I definitely get a grassy note on this 12-year-old. It's not listed here, but I don't know if anyone gets that kind of wispy, hay, grassy sort of quality on the finish. So keep some of your tasting notes in mind as we move into what components we want to be a little bit heavier in our blend. So we have a 12, 16, and 21 for the Royal Brackla. And then a quick note on Baines. Now, actually, Baines, it's not in my portfolio. I don't work on Baines. But when thinking about, okay, now we need a grain whiskey, right? So we've been talking about malt. The malt whiskeys are going to be the most dominant flavor profiles in a blended Scotch. If you imagine a blended Scotch is an orchestra, there's lots of different instruments and they're all working together to create music. And then the actual single malts that we're drinking are the solo act. So they're going to be a little bit more dominant and will really drive what a blend tastes like. And then corn and wheat whiskey is going to be a little bit more of that, more of a backseat or take a backseat in the blended Scotch in regards to flavor. Now, it's very difficult to actually get the grain whiskey that would go into a blend. So we had to compromise, right? Because a lot of the grain whiskeys, the corn or wheat whiskeys that are released from Scotland are well over 30 years old. And I think that should be drank on its own. I don't know if we should be blending that necessarily. So we went with, and I worked with Bikram from Norfolk Wine and Spirits, and I said, it's a favorite of mine in regard to corn whiskey. And this is actually produced in the exact same style that would be produced for corn on a column still in Scotland, but this is a distillery in South Africa. So you have to bear with us. We have to be creative as we're starting our own new companies as blenders. So this was something that would be close or reminiscent to what you might get from a Scotch whiskey column distillation grain distillery. And as you see here, obviously, same sort of concept as the pot stills, but I've shown some of the different column stills that would have produced this whiskey. So what will happen is actually that beer is produced in the same way. The beer will be funneled into the top of that column still. There will be plates at different points throughout the neck of the column, and you will have hot steam rushing up from below, and you're still working on boiling points of alcohol, ethanol, and water, right? You're still separating away. At each plate, they'll know what ABV they'll be able to capture and what they want to take. And on a column still, you're able to distill to a higher ABV. So we typically, grain whiskey will be distilled to a higher ABV as well. This was aged in exclusively ex-bourbon cask, this Baines corn single grain whiskey. So it is going to have quite a sweetness to it. So just know that normally it wouldn't be that sweet, but I think this is a great representation of one of the other components that would go into a blended Scotch if we were trying to make Dewar's, for instance. All right, so let's see if there's any more questions. I'm going to show you what the blend was that I created. I sat on my floor and actually blended some of these together a few days ago. I had in mind what I would marry together to make my own version of Dewar's or Holly's blend, as I guess I would call it. Hopefully some of you, maybe you've already started, grabbing a clean glass. Definitely start small, and you'll probably only be able to make one or two versions of your blend, but I hope that this encourages you to really focus in on the malts that you preferred and trying to amplify those and have some extra layers added for some of the other whiskeys that we have here. Let's see here. Are there any blended Scotch whiskeys with rye grain? There are some rye whiskeys coming out of Scotland, but not as a blend, as exclusively rye. And the reason that rye is not used that often out in blends is because it is a beast to work with. It's very difficult during fermentation. Rye can get very sticky. It's not an easy grain to work with necessarily. There's a reason why it kind of got ditched for a while. So typically in Scotland, they're going to use corn or wheat. It depends on really what's a little bit cheaper, right? So right now, most distilleries in Scotland are using corn for their grain whiskey. All right, so does anyone want to share maybe what proportions or what blend or even which malt they want to, to have dominate their blend? Or I'll just show mine maybe. Maybe Kevin's made one at home. Maybe John has too.
Making one right now.
I'll give everyone a few moments. Or you just drink all your whiskeys and you're happy as a clam anyway. So it's a win-win for this.
If someone wants to share, you can click on the participants button, and then it should be like a little bit, I think there's a way to, actually I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves. So if you want to share with Holly a blend that you made, feel free to unmute and tell her what you did.
So someone asked, how do you blend, right? And to be honest, there's really no right or wrong way. It's whoever is in control of the whiskey. So, you know, whoever, maybe someone really likes peated and aggressive style whiskey. So maybe you make Craigellachie more than half of your blend, right? And a little bit of that sweeter Aberfeldy and Baines and Royal Brackla. So it's all about which flavor components that you preferred and building off of those to accent and build off of it. Now, I will say in the Scotch whiskey industry, typically at least 50% of a blend, if not more, will be the corn whiskey. So you can go, you know, old school, or you can just do whatever you want. I did not go heavy on the grain. You'll see it in mine. I chose to go heavier on the malts.
I enjoyed the Craigellachie with the Baines, about half and half. I thought it was a very, it was interesting balancing. The Baines is very, I think, pie spices and sweet, and the Craigellachie is a little bit more, as you said, aggressive. And together, I thought it was really quite nice.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, I mean, you can omit ones too, right? So, yeah, it's really up to you all, and you know, use the funnel for future blends as well. I mean, there's no possible way that we can all create that Dewar's 12, right? It's just not physically impossible. We don't have casks of 40 different distilleries, and there's obviously hundreds of casks being married together. But this is a way to start to make your own whiskey. And I have a good friend up in Westchester who has a small little barrel, and he is so passionate about it. He buys random grain whiskeys and he makes his own blends. He just likes to create new flavors that are not offered in the everyday market. So, you know, it's just a new way to explore the whiskey. All right, do you want to see my Holly's blend?
I find that a little bit of Craigellachie goes a long way, and I've always heard that about peated whiskey. I know this one isn't peated, but it still has that character where it just really asserts itself in a blend.
Definitely. And Stephanie actually calls Craigellachie it's the elbow into like the side of the blend. So, you know, if you were to, it's not as aggressive as peat. Peat would push you over, but she said that people ask for Craigellachie for their blends when they want to just throw an elbow into the side of the blend, and you don't need a lot, right? It's got that aggression. So that's a good point, Kevin, because she says use Craigellachie with caution.
I agree.
All right, I'll share mine here. So this is what I did. I did basically about an ounce. I love Aberfeldy as the base. I guess I was trying to channel my inner Dewar's. So I made Aberfeldy the main component. Went a little bit lighter on the Baines. The Baines is a little bit dry for me, so I wanted to make sure to not go too far with that. I wanted some of that grassy undertone with Royal Brackla, and then I really just did a few drops with that pipette of Craigellachie. And on the nose, that was plenty. That was plenty with Craigellachie. And this is what my tasting notes for Holly's blend were. So I ended up seeing Aberfeldy was kind of the base, along with the Baines. I got the Craigellachie up front and a little bit throughout, and then the Royal Brackla with some of that grassiness and that chilled out sort of flavor profile on the finish. Did anyone create something they didn't like? I guess we'll find out in the breakout meetings. Let's see. I think I got most of the questions. There was a question. So you can, in blended Scotch whiskey, you can put honey, or you can make it a liqueur. So you can add components. But when we're talking about flavor notes and tasting notes of most blended scotches and single malts, those are naturally occurring from the processes at the distillery. So from the natural grain, from the fermentation process, and from what we do with the stills and the casks. So nothing's being added to these whiskeys.
Holly, there was a question, I apologize if you responded and I missed it, about, you can age Scotch and other whiskeys in X wine casks, but is there an example or other thoughts about blending actual wine into whiskey? Sure, that's not legal in Scotch whiskey, but what examples could you talk to in that regard?
Ask the Canadians. I think maybe that's where the Crown Royal came from. Yes, in every country. That's why I don't claim, although there are some new instances and new distilleries that I think might be changing my mind, but I do not claim that we have terroir in whiskey, right? Because distillation is so aggressive. I can't tell you with this Aberfeldy 12 bottle that it was a great barley year, right? But it's definitely regional, and every country has made decisions on what it legally means to be called whiskey in their country. So for instance, actually in India, they can't export it because it has to, most of the world, the majority of the world, to be called whiskey legally, it has to be an alcohol distilled from a grain, which we're working with, right? Rye, corn, wheat, barley, you can do oats, you can do, there's lots of different types of grains you can use. We have the main ones. Whiskey is a much looser term in India. So a lot of the whiskey that's being drank within India is actually what we would call rum. So you really have to, especially as new producing regions and new countries are producing whiskey, most are following the Scotch or American way. But definitely do a little bit of research on it, because who knows what else might have gone into it, right? And actually Canadian whiskey to this day, you can still add a small proportion of basically fortified wines and different wines. So
yeah, 1 to 10, right? So 1 part in 11 can be something that's not actual whiskey, 9.09%, which is a lot.
Well, and that's something where, especially with single malt, but Scotch in general, some people feel that the rules that the Scotch Whisky Association, the government has put on the term Scotch, and for that, for the country and for the category, it hinders the creativity and whatnot. But also it's important, right? Because as consumers, really also in the past 10, 20 years, we have more questions around what we're putting in our body. This whole farm to table movement, and we want to know, what did you do to that? It's not the 40s and 50s anymore, where we kind of just trust what you put in front of us because someone in power said, here, eat this or drink this. So I really think that's why, one of many reasons, single malt Scotch has really become popular, because there are so many rules around that term, and even more so for single malt, that you can look at this bottle and know that everything, there's nothing added. It's just those 3 ingredients plus oak cask, so water, barley, and yeast. Nothing else can be added. Aged in oak cask for a minimum of at least 12 years in a day, so there could be older whiskeys in here. Everything came from Royal Brackla Distillery. I mean, this is transparency in a bottle, right? It's, exactly, and a lot of times now you can go visit it. So you can fall in love with it, and you can go fly over to the distillery and see where everything that you've been drinking was produced. And think about the food industry, and you can't say that for a lot of things that we ingest as humans. And so I really think that's one of the reasons why Scotch has, stood the test of time. Yes, we have a lot of rules. It's a lot to remember. It can be a little bit of a barrier to entry to the category, but once you're in, and once you've tasted some of the flavors, and you can really just, the world is your oyster at that point. You know what you're getting when you look at the bottle. So, oh, good. Yeah. So people are talking all sorts of whiskey. That's good. So we got the ABV of the Baines. So hopefully that was a nice little intro. We really just want to encourage to, take control of your drinking, basically. So try different whiskeys, see what you want to marry together. You've got the pipette and the funnel now, so go grab whatever you have on your shelf or in your cupboard and start mixing away and see if you're going to be the next, maybe the 8th master blender of Doers. And thanks again to Kevin as well. And I don't know if Bikram and Elias are on, but really we wouldn't be drinking these without them either. So any questions, please shoot me an email. You can shoot me a note on Instagram too. I know it's hard with these because I didn't actually get to hear any of your voices, but I do hope that you all were able to take something new away from this.
Yeah, and we actually have a few minutes available. I think you are the first presenter to have come in under the technical time limit. So
I thought that I only had 45 minutes. Did I have more than that?
We've got a little bit more. I think we could go for about another 10. If folks wanted to unmute, you're welcome to.
Oh, yeah. I thought I only had 45, so I was waiting for Kevin to yell at me because I thought I was over. So that's great. We covered a lot, so hopefully.
Yeah, you did. We've still got a couple questions on the site here. There might have been some that I missed checking off, but if someone has an open burning question, feel free. Otherwise, we'll go to breakouts in a few minutes, but I'll just open it up here. If you want to ask Holly something, go ahead.
I see a few on here that I didn't get to. So someone asked about Aberfeldy and switching from the squirrel logo and the gold bottle, and actually I have one right here. Someone wants to see the original squirrel that we used to have. Everyone can see the cute little squirrel. Yes, no more squirrel. As you have seen, you were an original Aberfeldy drinker, so thank you for, it was just a change in packaging. I think obviously with the honeyed notes and, we want it to be a little bit more true to what it tastes like and be a little bit more on point with that. So the squirrel is no more, but the squirrel was cute. So if you see some older bottles of Aberfeldy, we used to have a squirrel logo. Just FYI.
The squirrel one's also one that says the Heart of Doers right on the label, doesn't it?
So that's where it was, because that's actually not correct. Right. So not actually correct. So bad on our company, right? Yeah, and then there was another, and that switch was, a good 3 or 4 years ago, if not more, probably at least 4. Let's see here. Did many distilleries move to more copper contact to produce a lighter spirit recently, or did this shift happen during the 90s during the peak of vodka? It actually happened more so after World War II is when most of the switch from worm tubs over into shell and tube. But you're correct on the 90s when it was definitely clear spirits, which sounds like just like a really miserable time. But yes, whiskey fell out of fashion in that 90s time frame. But if you look, if you watch Mad Men and you look at the bottle placements in ruined TV shows like I do, it's actually quite accurate. A lot of people were drinking Canadian whiskey and a lot of some American and blended Scotch. So people wanted something, that's where that term smooth came from, right? You didn't want aggression. So it was to be able to go into cocktails and not be polarizing. So most distilleries switched over to that shell and tube in the 50s and 60s. And that is the case for Aberfeldy as well. There's only 18 distilleries left with worm tub condensers, although a new distillery is being built. So there is a shift now, a mentality to go back to worm tubs. So someone asked about the Baines. So we don't have an age statement for the Baines. And to be honest, I don't know the legal maturation laws for South Africa off the top of my head. I would assume it's probably around 4 or 5 years old, if I had to guess. Typically when in the Scotch whiskey world, if there's no age, you can assume kind of like this 5 to 8, or maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that sort of range, a mixture of casks. A bit hot, so yeah, if it's a little hot for your palate, I mean, it's a different grain, different distillation technique, so definitely will sit differently on the palate. Oh, so the infinity bottles. Yeah, I guess what was the specific question about infinity bottles? Do I believe in them, or do the brands believe in them? Sure, I think we do. Infinity bottles are, whoever asked about that was actually the first question. Do you want to, I can't see who it was.
Yeah, how do brands feel about infinity bottles in light of this workshop? Is there a market for assisted or recommended do-it-yourself whiskey blending?
There really isn't. Although recently I saw that Chivas was doing some sort of blending thing too. It's pretty hard to do your own blend, even though we're doing it right now, just because we don't have access to what a typical blend would be. You know, we're talking about, 20 plus single malt whiskeys going into that. So it's a pretty significant undertaking. What I actually really liked about this was I want to push the flavor profile boundaries, right? So we have all of these brands that maybe we're trying and we know and we like, but how do we take that to the next level and play off of those flavors? So to be honest, obviously Baines is not part of my portfolio, but I don't care, because if you're drinking whiskey, I'm happy, right? We're a community, and I think you should blend together whatever you think might be a fit. A lot of times I don't even get to the blending part of it because I just drink the whiskey neat right out of the bottle. So it just depends on how much time you have on your hands too.
There's a question that's been out here for a while about the exceptional casks as well.
Okay. So the exceptional casks, for here in North America, we focus for that range with Aberfeldy and Craigellachie. And the exceptional casks can be a few things. They're either a single cask that Stephanie has chosen or deemed to be just exceptional. It could be what's called a double cask, which is she'll put together 2 casks and finish it for usually many years in some other type of oak. So there's single cask and double cask. And then there's also small batch, which will be a marriage of maybe 4 to 6 different casks. So these actually, just last fall is the first time ever that North America has been lucky enough to get exceptional casks of Aberfeldy and Craigellachie. So they were all single casks. We had a 24-year-old Aberfeldy, a 19 and an 18, and a 23 and 19 of Craigellachie. So those were all at natural cask strength, range from anywhere from just under 300 bottles up to 400. So you get exact bottle count, cask number. So very limited editions to see Aberfeldy and Craigellachie in a different light. So they'll be similar to what we tasted, but slightly different because they're one single cask. So it's a real focus on a specific type of cask. And that's when I said wink, wink for this fall, to keep an eye out for some small batch releases that will be coming out of Aberfeldy.
So it sounds like those, when they're dubbed exceptional casks, it's either after they've been aged for some amount of time and they're finished then for a few more years, or it's right when they're going to bottle them. It's not like it comes off the still and they say, we've got this honey cask that we're going to put it into in the best part of the warehouse and like age it for 19 years. So it's kind of down the road a bit more that they decide this is going to be an exceptional cask.
Yeah, and I think it's for us too, we've only been these single malts that you see here bottled as is and available to anyone in the world for really the past 5 or 6 years. And so we were laying down whiskey for many, many decades before that and not thinking about what our future as a single malt was, which means that they have some pretty random wild casks, right? So it's definitely has to be exceptional. We were laying down really whatever type of cask we could get. It wasn't really a thought process. So that's why I think the exceptional casks are a cool look into Stephanie finding a true hidden gem, because we were not laying down whiskey with that in mind, like some of the brands that have been around a little bit longer. So they yeah. Oh, perfect. So I think we've got the Thanks, John, for the infinity bottles. And the River Spey, when I visited the distillery in Aberfeldy, I was told that the only thing they use is Spey water for cooling. The processed water is from the wells in the Highland. I'd have to look up Aberfeldy distillery. I've been there, but I just don't remember their exact, what water sources they're using. Water, I don't want to break anyone's heart. Water, I know, is obviously a main ingredient, but water with distillation, it's not necessarily driving the flavor as much as I think we were told in the past, right? So water, of course, is important. You know, you have hard water and soft water, and you need a consistent amount of water. But it's more so these distilleries in Scotland are on those major water sources that are so iconic and famous because they were consistent and, you know, they needed all of that water. So they probably are using multiple sources for what we call production water versus actual bottling water. So production water would be for your heat exchangers, right? To cool down things or maybe even heat up things. And then anything that touches the product, which would be in your filling the cask, you might add water to lower the ABV down to around 63.5. And also water that you then lower the ABV again further when you go into bottling. So there's lots of different places that you might pull water from for different parts of the process. So that could be correct for Aberfeldy. They probably have multiple sources of water for different parts of the process. I know water it's obviously a romantic part, but sorry, I'm a little bit, I don't mean to ruin people's day with the water. I know it is important, but it's not driving flavor from a scientific perspective as much as I think we originally thought.
There's a question, Holly. I don't know if you feel comfortable responding, but if you had to choose a whiskey outside the Bacardi portfolio, what would be your go-to?
Well, it depends on my mood too and who I'm with, but I'm a Springbank fan as well. So if you see Springbank out there, if I like Craigellachie, right? I mean, I like them all for certain occasions too, but I like some sweetness with some funk, hence why Craigellachie is, you know, tends to be a go-to for me. And Springbank is peated, so it does have some of that funk in a different manner. But yeah, I think there's some other Springbank fans out there as well. But to be honest, I drink bourbon. I drink Japanese whiskey, Tasmanian whiskey. If you put it in front of me, I will gladly sample it and see if I like it. And there was a question about yeast as well. Typically in Scotland, we stick to our roots a little bit, and most of the time we use what's called distiller's yeast at all of the distilleries. Some will use it as in a dry yeast format, some in a slurry or a cream yeast. Again, think about these distilleries as they need to stay true to their flavor profile because they are, yes, standalone, but also still need to go into blends and be consistent. So in Scotland, it's all about consistency. Where other countries, Teeling, for example, over in Ireland, they use a white wine yeast and a distiller's yeast. Some people use brewers and distillers. Actually, I think Ben Romick might be one that uses some brewers and distillers. So you will see it once in a while, but typically most distilleries in Scotland will just use distiller's yeast. So we're not too experimental on that front, not yet at least. And someone asked about the Aberfeldy water source. Yeah, I probably shouldn't have left that out as we're talking about water. One of the other reasons why Aberfeldy is known as the Golden Dram is the Patilly Burn is our water source at Aberfeldy Distillery. It runs right behind the distillery, and it is said to have alluvial gold. So it has small pieces of gold. And apparently some decent sized chunks of gold have been found there in the past. So sometimes when you go to the distillery, they'll have people panning for gold just to act it out. But What is ironic is that in the UK, unless you have a permit, if you find gold, it actually belongs to the Queen. So if you find it by accident, it's technically not your gold. So probably just stay in the Highlands and don't tell anyone. But yes, the Patilly burn is said to be laced with gold. So obviously a huge part of our story too when you go to the distillery. Let's see here, bourbons. So yeah, the Bacardi thing is, and I saw too that we obviously have a family member joining in a few weeks as well to talk about rum. So Bacardi owns actually a decent amount of whiskey distilleries and around the world. And what's fantastic is they really let us stay true to what we are and just keep doing what we do. So their first single malt distillery was Devon, which is that one on the far right in the sea glass bottle. They acquired that distillery in northern Scotland when they acquired Martini and Rossi in 1991. So Martini and Rossi owns, there's lots of different ownership stories throughout all the tales of time in the alcohol world. So that was their first actual Scotch whiskey venture. And then in the late 90s, 1998, they acquired Dewar's and the 4 other single malts. They also own Teeling Irish whiskey in Dublin. And they also own Angel's Envy, producing bourbon and rye, and the majority stakeholder in Compass Box as well. So definitely, but they let these brands do as they do, right? So we're pretty lucky to have, I think, a pretty stellar whiskey portfolio.